Hello everyone, welcome to a new tutorial series where I'm going to be showing you how to draw a kingfisher bird using coloured pencils. So in this first part I thought I would show you some of the basic techniques that you are going to need along the way when we're doing this tutorial series. So I'm going to show you how you can use solvent, how you can do layers, and also how you can add layers on top of the solvent as well. So the first thing that I'm going to do is show you how you can create layers so that they're ready to be blended out with solvent. So I'm just going to show an example patch of some of the feather colours and the textures that we're going to be using in this bird drawing. So the first thing that I'll be doing is applying some shadows with a black pencil. So that will be the first step when I'm doing the body and the head of the bird. So what I'll probably do is I'll just go and block in some of the darkest marks of the bird, and I'll just block in all of the shadowed areas. So I'm just going to give you an example of how I do that. So I'd look at the way the feathers are going, so the direction of the feathers, and just block in all of the darkest parts. So this is just an example, so I'm just going to show you how you can layer the colours and then blend it with the solvent. So when you're doing feathers, you can either use little lines or circular motions, but I recommend to use little pencil strokes in lines that are going with the length that the actual feathers are going in. So the feathers on the head are actually smaller and shorter than the feathers on the body of the bird. So you've got to bear that in mind when you do your pencil strokes. You don't want to do really long pencil strokes for short feathers. So I'm not following any reference photo, I'm just getting in some dark pencil marks. Okay, then once I've added in the shadowed areas, I'll go in with the black pencil again and just use that to kind of deepen up some of the darkest areas. So I'm just going to layer another layer on top. Now the important thing when you're using solvent is to not apply lots of pressure onto the paper. So the whole point of using solvent is we don't want to damage the tooth of the paper. We want to be able to add lots and lots of layers on top once we've added the solvent. So at no point should you need to apply lots of pressure, because we are going to use the solvent to blend out all of the graininess and take all that graininess away and get a smooth look. And we build up that smoothness over time using the solvent. Okay, so once I've added the shadows, I'll then go in with the kind of base tones. So a lot of the feathers on the bird are blue, so I'll go in with just a generic blue colour that best suits the reference photo, and I'll just shade it all the way across the area that we're working on. So for the first layer, it's not about making all the details, it's just about getting sort of the base tones down, where the shadows are, where the highlights are, and just a basic colour across the whole area. And then once we've added the solvent and waited for it to dry, we can then render all of the details. So I'd add a really light layer of that blue pencil all the way across, and as you can see, I'm using the side of the pencil so that I can evenly shade across that whole area. So also, if you rotate the pencil, you can see that it will now be on a new sharp part of the point, and so you can get into those like white grainy bits, but you really don't need to, because the solvent will blend that out once we add it. Okay, then what I'll do is I'll glaze other colours over the top to make it a bit more colour accurate. So on the bird, it's actually a green sort of turquoise blue feather colour. So I'll add some other green tones and turquoise colours to make it a bit more accurate. And remember, I said that it's really important to have a lot of pigment down on your paper before you actually use the solvent, so it actually has something to move around and blend together. If there's not enough pigment down on your paper, then you're going to get a very patchy look and it will still look grainy. So it's important to keep adding these layers. So the more layers you do, the more pigment that's down, so you can get a nice smooth blending. So this kind of tutorial isn't about how to render accurate feathers. I'm just showing you the techniques and the process that we'll be using. Okay, so once we've got the colours down, I'll then go in with a darker shadowed colour, so the indigo blue, though that doesn't really matter. And I'll just use that to show and indicate where the shadows are. So say the shadows were on this side and the highlights were up here, I'll just add that darker blue tone wherever the shadows are. See, I'm using the side of the pencil and also a bit further back on the pencil to limit the pressure that I'm applying. So if you apply too much pressure, you're burnishing, and that means that you're not going to be able to apply many layers. And you really don't need to apply lots of pressure, so try and avoid it, because you will be surprised at how well the solvent blends them together and makes the colours look really, really vibrant. So now I'm just going to indicate with this dark blue as if there was some feather kind of marks there. Okay, and then I'm just going to go over once more with that normal blue pencil just to make sure that I've got enough of the pigment down across the whole area. If you haven't used solvent before, then it's definitely worth experimenting before you go and do your final piece. And I'm going to add some more of that turquoise. Okay, so now that you've got your first layer done, the thing you need to do next is blend it out with solvent. So what I'm using is the pencil blend by Zest It, and you can also use things like paint thinner or Gamsol and like Rowan alcohol and stuff like that. I've heard a good one for people in America is the Mona Lisa odorless paint thinner, but you can try out lots of different things, but I like this one because it's specifically made to blend out coloured pencils, and it's meant to be a bit less kind of toxic. When you're using solvents, make sure that you always have a window or door open, some sort of ventilation, because it can get quite toxic, especially if you're using like paint thinner. So definitely make sure you have some sort of ventilation. And if you're not using it, keep the lid on it at all times. Okay, so when you're doing your first layer, I'm just using a paintbrush and I'm dipping it into the bottle. You can dab away the excess if you want, but I'm just kind of getting rid of the excess on the rim here. So just get rid of any excess so it's not absolutely dripping. And then I'm just using this small brush. It doesn't really matter what brush you use. And then I'm just going to use circular motions to apply it everywhere. This really helps mix it all together and gets rid of that graininess. Obviously, the more layers you do, the smoother look you'll get. And you can see just how vibrant the colours become. So I keep dipping the paintbrush into the paint thinner. With the first layer you can use quite a lot of the solvent, but as you go on to more and more layers, try to use less and less because you don't want to ruin the layers underneath that you've already done. Also be careful not to kind of smear all of the dark colours into the lighter colours. Okay, and now the important thing once you've done this is to give it enough time to completely dry before you try and add lots of coloured pencil over the top. So you've got to bear in mind that once you've added this, you've made the paper wet. So if you tried to add coloured pencil straight away, then you would be damaging the tooth of the paper because the paper's wet and it's kind of weak. So you've weakened it by making it wet. So you need to wait for it to dry so that you can add the coloured pencil without damaging the paper. So I'd give it as long as possible, at least about 10 minutes, but I like to leave it for about half an hour, especially on the first layer because you've used a lot of the solvent and you really want to make sure that the paper is completely dry. But again, this comes down to like experimenting and see what works best for you, because all paint thinners and solvents will be different, so you've got to judge it on the one that you're using. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to give it a few minutes to dry and then we'll be back and I'll show you how you can add a second layer on top, how you can use the white pencil to create little highlights, and how you can just add another layer on top to add more detail. Okay, so I've just waited for the solvent to completely dry and now we're going to go on to adding a second layer. So the first thing that I will do is I'll be using the white pencil to add the highlights. So as you can see, when you add the white pencil, it goes over the top of this really nicely. So I'll be using it in little lines and I'll just be using it to add all of the details and the highlights. So I'm just going to create some fur marks. We'll be using lots of small lines to create the feathers. So again, I'm not using a reference photo for this part, so I'm just sort of not doing this realistically, showing you more how the white pencil shows up on top of this sort of part that we've already done the solvent on. So it does really show up well. You can use it to add little marks or longer fur strokes, and it shows up well on top of the darker areas as well. So you can use it to add all of the details and then glaze over the blue colours that we used earlier. So some of these areas I'll be glazing over with the blue in a minute to show you how that can make a difference. So one important thing to mention is that you will always need to be keeping your pencil really sharp when you're doing this. So for areas that you want lighter, you can use more pressure on the white pencil. So just to make some of them stand out even more. So the next thing I'd be doing once I've done that is going back in with the black pencil to add in the shadows again. So this really stands up on top of this first layer. So remember, this isn't meant to look realistic, this is just showing you how these colours can overlap onto this first layer. We'll be applying it to the bird and how to do feathers in the actual tutorial, but this is a technique that you'll need to know, so how you can add the second layer on top. So once you've added black, it can look a bit flat, so what I then do is I go in with a blue colour, so I'm going in with the indigo blue, and I just use that on top of the black just to make it look more less flat, so make it look a bit more rich rather than just being black. You can also use this between other groups of feathers. So then I'd go in with the blue pencil and start to add more colour to the feathers wherever I need to build up the saturation. So that's what I'll be doing. Once I've added the solvent, added the white and the black, I'll be adding these colours to add the saturation levels back up. Just to make it look nice and blue. Also layering some of that blue tone over the shadowed areas, again to give a bit more vibrancy. I'm still not applying lots of pressure, it easily glides onto the top of this second layer, on top of the first layer, so I don't need to apply lots of pressure to it, which is really good because it saves your arms and hands aching because you are applying lots of pressure to the pencil like you would have to do in the burnishing method. And again, I'll just go in and glaze over the second blue to add a bit more of a correct tone. So once you've done that, you can go back in with the solvent. So remember I said you'll be using less on your brush. So I'm just going to wipe off the excess, and I'm very lightly using that just to buff out some of this grainy areas. Remember, you still need quite a lot of pigment down on the paper before you blend out the second layer, and the more layers you do, the smoother and smoother it should get. Obviously, if I was using a reference photo, it would look realistic. When I'm doing the actual tutorial, I don't actually go in a second time with the solvent. I feel like I don't need to in that situation, so I just thought I'd show you how you would if you were doing it and you felt like you needed to show you how you could blend it out a second time. So the most important thing to remember is to use much less solvent on your brush. If that's one tip that you remember from this tutorial, it's that the more layers you do, the less and less solvent you need to use. Else it will just look a mess if you use the same amount of solvent. You really don't need hardly anything on your brush as you get up to these second, third or even fourth layers of blending out. So then you'd wait for this to dry a second time. You don't need to wait as long because we haven't put as much solvent on, so I'm just going to give it a couple of minutes and then I'm going to pull up some more highlights. So now I'm just going to add some more white pencil over the top. Again, because you've added this solvent and let it dry, you can go in and add even more of the white pencil. So you can go over the top of these darker areas. So now I'm just adding some more blue. And as long as you limit your pressure on the pencil, there really isn't a limit to how many layers you can do. Also, once you've used the solvent, the blue will really show up on top of that black. So you can really tint that shadowed colour to make it look more of a realistic tone. Anyway, so that's pretty much the technique that we'll be using when we're doing the feathers. That's the sort of process we're going to be using and the order that we're going to be doing things in. So have a little practice of this on a scrap piece of paper before you try the tutorial series. So I recommend just getting a reference photo up of like a feather and a bird and having a look at the feathers, and try to do this using an actual reference photo and see how you get on with the solvent. So remember, first layer you can use quite a lot of the solvent, you need to give it extra time to dry. Once you blend it out the second time, you don't need as much time, but remember to use less solvent, much less solvent, not even just a little bit less, a lot less. And yeah, so that's it for today's part. So that's it for the basic techniques that you're going to need, and I will see you when we start drawing the bird. Bye guys!